The streets of Paris didn't see rain that day, they saw a river of blood. How did the sharp blade of the guillotine separate thousands of heads from their bodies? The gruesome story of Robespierre's Reign of Terror will freeze your blood.
Chapter 1 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Harlan and A. B. Poland. Chapter 1 Lorenzo the Magnificent, 1449 to 1492. The 1,000 years between the downfall of the Roman Empire and the discovery of America are called the Middle Ages, which means the ages between ancient and modern times. This was a very stormy period. In the early part, the barbarians overran Europe and destroyed almost every sign of civilization. They were brought under some control through the efforts of the Church, and as time advanced there was progress in the arts of civilized life. Schools were established in monasteries, and here and there in large cities, but there was no general popular education as we consider it now. This is not so strange, for there were no printed books. The printing press had not been invented. All books at that time were manuscripts. That is, they were written by hand, for that is what the word manuscript means. They were written on parchment, which was sheepskin specially prepared so that it would take ink. Of course books written by hand were expensive, for it took a great deal of time to write them. Most of the people in Europe, therefore, lived and died without ever having a book in their hands. In only a few of the largest cities and monasteries was it possible to find a library containing as many as 500 volumes. When at length the printing press was invented, the desire for knowledge became widely spread. People felt that they must have books to read, and to study. They saw the necessity for schools in which their children might be taught. Of all the countries in Europe none was more thoroughly awakened than Italy, and among the places that were thus aroused to a desire for knowledge of all kinds, one of the first was the city of Florence. Florence early became the home of many learned men, and no city did more for the enlightenment of Europe than she. Here lived the famous family of the Medici. For several generations the Medici had been engaged in what was then almost the only commerce of the world. This was trade with India. Caravans of camels brought silks and shawls, spices and precious stones from the Far East to the shores of the Mediterranean. Ships transported them to Florence. Trains of pack horses and mules carried them from Florence across the passes of the Alps to the cities of northern and western Europe. This traffic had made the Medici very wealthy, and not only wealthy but powerful. For 300 years the family ruled the city and people of Florence. But it was not their wealth alone that gave them their power. Their political influence based on industrial conditions was great also. The city was, like ancient Athens, a state. It made its own laws, and had the right to coin its own money. It made war or peace with foreign countries. The government of the state was republican. But Florence was one of the strangest little republics that ever existed. It had this peculiar law, that no man should hold the office of chief magistrate unless he belonged to one of the guilds, or arts as they were called. These were about the same as our modern trades unions. But the Florentines had even more such unions than we have. Not only were there unions of carpenters and masons and others who worked with their hands, the people who worked with their heads were also united. There were arts or unions of the bankers, the merchants, the doctors, and the lawyers. From the members of the arts the Florentines chose their officers. The government of the city was vested in the great Council of 9. These 9 consisted of 7 who were head workers, and 2 who were hand workers. This arrangement brought those who worked with their heads and those who worked with their hands very close together. It caused the lawyers and merchants and bankers to have a friendly feeling for the carpenters and masons and others who made their living by the sweat of their brows, and no man could long be ruler in Florence who did not love the working people. The Medici family were famed for doing good with their money among the people of Florence. And therefore one after another of them found it easy either to be made the standard bearer, as the President of the Republic was called, or to have men put into office who would carry out his wishes. In 1449, just about the time when Europe was preparing to enter upon a period of renewed activity, one of the Medici line was born who was named Lorenzo. He died in 1492, the very year in which Columbus discovered America. His grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici, had given many fine buildings to Florence, among which was its famous cathedral. Lorenzo's father had also spent immense sums of money for the benefit of Florence. He had been really the ruler of the city for many years, although he very seldom held the office of standard-bearer or had any official title. When he died, the people of Florence desired that another of the Medici should manage the Republic, and therefore they invited Lorenzo to do for them as his father had done. He accepted their invitation and became their ruler. He proved to be much like the famous Athenian, Pisistratus, a tyrant who was not tyrannical. He ruled for the welfare of the people. He did not think that the first duty of a good ruler was to make his people soldiers. He saw that the best thing to be done for the Florentines was to enlighten them, to furnish them with books and schools. But where were the books to be procured? There were monasteries in various parts of Europe, in which were large numbers of books, and among these were the manuscripts of many works of the old Greeks and Romans. But the principal hiding place of manuscripts, especially those of Greek writers, was Constantinople. And it happened in a very strange way that the books of Constantinople were at that very time being brought to Western Europe. The inhabitants of Constantinople were Greeks. They read the writings of Homer and Plato, and the Gospels and Epistles of the New Testament in the original Greek. The Turks, who had long been menacing the city, cared nothing for Homer and Plato, and they hated the books of the New Testament. They thought that men needed no book but the Koran of Mohammed. Many of them believed that no one ought to read any other book. At length, in 1453, Constantinople was actually taken by the Turks, and a great number of its people escaped and went forth to seek new and peaceful homes in Western Europe. Many went to Italy, and of these, several found their way to Florence. Some of these men brought manuscripts with them, and they told their new Italian friends that others might be obtained in Constantinople. After this the Medici, and men like them, carried on for years a diligent search for books. They sent men to the monasteries of Italy, Germany, and England, and to Constantinople, to purchase whatever ancient manuscripts they could find. One of these, who went to the old Eastern capital, brought back 238, among which were the writings of Plato and Xenophon, who lived in Athens 400 years before Christ. Lorenzo caused many of the old manuscripts to be copied, and what was better, he had them printed. For just before Lorenzo's birth, Gutenberg had perfected his printing press, and 3 years after Lorenzo was born, the first book printed in Florence had made its appearance. It was an edition of Virgil, the great Latin poet, and very likely Lorenzo used a copy of it when he studied Latin. He lived to see books wonderfully multiplied. By the time he was 30 years old, Virgil and Horace, Homer and Xenophon could be printed so cheaply that they were bought for schoolboys. Like other merchant princes of the time, Lorenzo established a famous school in Florence. It was a Greek high school. So many learned men graduated from it and became celebrated teachers, that the people said it was like the wooden horse at the siege of Troy, out of which came so many Greek warriors fully armed for the fight. Although Lorenzo was called the Magnificent by the people of Florence, and was apparently so generous towards them, yet Florence was not really enriched by him. He only made it grander and more famous by his administration, but he completed that subversion of the Florentine Republic for which his father and his grandfather had well prepared the way. Florence, although so splendid, was full of corruption, her rulers violating oaths, betraying trusts, and living only for pleasure. From the days of Lorenzo de' Medici, her power has steadily declined. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Harron and A.B. Poland. Chapter 2. Christopher Columbus, 1435 to 1506. One day in the autumn of 1486, a stranger knocked at the gate of a convent called La Rabida, not far from the little Spanish seaport of Palos. He held by the hand a little boy, and when the monk who opened the door asked what was wanted, he answered, "My child and I are tired and hungry. Will you give us a morsel of bread and let us have rest here a while?" They were invited to enter, and food was set before them. During the meal the stranger began to talk about the Western Ocean and what must be on the other side of it. "Most men," he said, "think that beyond the Azores there is nothing but a sea of darkness. But I believe that beyond those islands there is another and larger land." The prior of the convent and the physician of Palos, who happened to be present, were greatly interested in what their visitor had to say, and asked him to tell them his name and something of his history. "I am called Christopher Columbus," he said. "I was born in Genoa, and there my boyhood was spent. I loved when a child to watch the sailors haul up the anchor and let loose the sails when a ship began her voyage. My play was to learn the names of the ropes and find out what each was for. My father sent me to the University of Pavia, and there I learned about the stars that guide the seaman on his way. I also learned to draw maps and charts. While drawing those maps, I used to wonder whether there was not some land beyond the Canaries and the Azores. At 15 I became a sailor. I went on voyages to England and Ireland, to Greece and elsewhere. On one of my voyages our ship was wrecked on the rocky coast of Portugal, but I got to land by the help of a plank. I stayed a while in Portugal, and there I married the daughter of a sea captain who was the governor of Porto Santo, one of the Madeira Islands. I afterwards visited Porto Santo, and there I met many men whose lives were spent in sailing the sea. They told me some wonderful tales. One said that a Portuguese pilot named Martin Vincente had picked up at sea 1,200 miles west of Portugal a piece of strange wood that had been carved by the hand of man. My brother-in-law said that he had seen at Porto Santo great pieces of jointed canes, and that a friend had told him about 2 human bodies which had been washed up at Flores, very broad-faced and not at all like Christians. All these things made me believe more firmly in the idea of a land to the westward, and at length I determined to find that land. But I was poor. I could not buy a ship nor pay a crew. I went to my native Genoa, where the masts in the harbor rise as close as the trees in a wood. I explained my plans to the rich merchants there and begged them to help me. But my countrymen were afraid to send any vessel of theirs beyond the Azores. They thought that west of those islands there was nothing but the sea of darkness. I went to Lisbon and asked the Portuguese king for help. Again, I was disappointed, but I was not discouraged. I then came to Spain, and at last the good Queen Isabella heard my story. A council of learned men was called to consider my plan. They said it was wild, and advised Her Majesty to give me no aid. Thus I am again disappointed. The little money that I had is spent, and I am a beggar. It seems as if the world is against me, yet I am sure that there is land beyond the sea. The prior, the physician, and the monks who had gathered about Columbus were much interested. Father Perez, one of the monks, had been confessor to Queen Isabella, and he wrote a letter to her begging that she would see Columbus again. She consented, and Columbus went from the convent to the palace to see her. The queen again refused his request, and Columbus set out for France, hoping that the king of that country might help him. But one of the officers of Isabella's court persuaded her to change her mind, and a messenger was sent to bring Columbus back into the royal presence. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were in camp at Santa Fe near Grenada, which they had but lately captured from the Floors, and there they signed an agreement to supply Columbus with 2 ships and to pay the crews. It was easy for the sovereigns to promise crews and to pay them, but it was very hard to find men who were willing to sail on such a voyage. Even the criminals who were promised pardon if they would go refused. To sail into the sea of darkness seemed certain death to them. At last, however, all difficulties were overcome. 2 wealthy gentlemen added a 3rd ship to the 2 supplied by the king and queen, and the wonderful voyage began. The Santa Maria, with a crew of 50 men, was commanded by Columbus himself. The Pinta, with 30 men, was in charge of Martin Pinzon, and the Nina, or Baby, with 24 men, was commanded by Martin's brother, Vincent Pinzon. At 8 o'clock in the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the sails were hoisted, and the little expedition left the harbor of Palos. On the 3rd day out, the Pinta lost her rudder. Fortunately, they were not far from the Canary Islands. They therefore steered for Tenerife, where they had the vessel repaired. When they had sailed about 6 weeks, they were astonished to find that the magnetic needle varied from its usual direction. Soon after observing this, they reached a part of the ocean where a great field of seaweed lay all around them. This was what is called the Sargasso Sea, and the ships of Columbus were the first that ever sailed across it. They observed another strange thing. The wind in this part of the ocean blew steadily, night and day, to the westward. It was the northeast trade wind, which was unknown to sailors along the coast and in the inland seas. They had excellent weather, but the men began to be fearful lest they could never beat back against the trade wind, and it was hard to keep them in good spirits. Happily, soon afterward, they saw some birds, and that made them sure that land was not far off. Then the Pinta fished up a fragment of sugar cane and a log of wood, and the Nina sighted a green branch covered with dog rose flowers. At 10 o'clock one night, Columbus saw a light ahead, and the next morning they landed on one of the Bahama Islands. Which island this was, we are not quite sure, but it was probably the one which the natives called Guanahani. Columbus named it San Salvador. When Columbus stepped from his boat, he carried with him the royal banner of Spain. Kneeling upon the shore with his companions, he kissed the ground, gave thanks to God, and took possession of the land in the name of Ferdinand and Isabella. The expedition afterwards discovered the islands of Cuba, Haiti, and the others of the West India group. On the shore of Haiti, the Santa Maria went aground and became a wreck. With the 2 remaining vessels, Columbus soon afterwards set sail for Spain, and on the 15th of March, 1493, he dropped anchor in the port of Palos. Ferdinand and Isabella were then at Barcelona, and they received him with great honor. He showed them curious plants and gaily colored parrots, and more interesting than these, 9 natives whom he had brought from the newly discovered islands. There was now no doubt that Columbus was right, and that the Sea of Darkness beyond the Azores was only a dream. It was determined that Columbus should make another expedition. In 6 months, 17 vessels and 1,500 men were ready to sail, and the second great voyage was begun. It was on this voyage that Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and several smaller islands were discovered. Most of the 1,500 men, however, went with Columbus not in the hope of discovering new lands, but for the purpose of colonizing the island of Haiti. Columbus had learned on his first voyage that on that island there were deposits of gold, so now a mining town was founded in the gold region of Haiti, and the work of digging was begun. But the Spaniards were not fond of work. They therefore made slaves of the natives and forced them to dig in the mines, and a large quantity of gold was secured. Some of the greedy colonists thought of another and easier way of making money. They captured a number of the natives and sent them to Spain to be sold as slaves. And strange to say, Columbus permitted this. When Queen Isabella heard of it, she was very angry with Columbus, and asked him who had given him the right to make slaves of her subjects. She commanded that every one of the Indians should be made free and sent home. This enslaving of the Indians was the beginning of the downfall of Columbus. Isabella never afterwards felt toward him as she had before. However, when he returned to Spain, he related a pitiful tale about the sufferings of the colonists in Haiti, and the Queen furnished him with supplies for them, and provided a fleet of 6 vessels with which he set sail on May 30th, 1498. On this 3rd voyage a new land was discovered. One day 3 hilltops were seen rising out of the sea, and soon the ships approached a large island. Columbus called it, from its 3 peaks, Trinidad, and the island is still known by that name. From Trinidad they sailed to the southwest until they approached another shore. Columbus had now discovered the southern grand division of the New World, but he did not know this. He supposed that the land was only another island. He was anxious to get back to the colony on the island of Haiti, and so sailing now to the northward, the ships in due time reached their harbor. In Haiti there were men plotting against Columbus. Some of the colonists who had not found so much gold as they had hoped for returned to Spain and complained to the king that Columbus was managing the colony badly. Ferdinand and Isabella partly believed what they said. As Columbus had done one wrong thing when he made slaves of the Indians, the king and queen thought he might do wrong in other things. Accordingly, they sent to Haiti a man named Bobadilla to take charge of the colony, and Bobadilla, on his arrival, accused Columbus of cruelty and injustice, and sent him to Spain in chains. The captain of the vessel in which he sailed wished to remove these fetters, but Columbus would not allow him to do so. He wore them to the end of the voyage and kept them as relics ever afterwards. As soon as the vessel reached Spain, Columbus wrote a letter to the king and queen, telling them what he had done and what had been done to him. When Isabella read it, she is said to have shed tears. His fetters were at once removed, and Ferdinand and Isabella refused to listen to the charges which Bobadilla had made against him. Columbus never so much as imagined that he had discovered a new continent. He supposed that Cuba, Jamaica, and the other islands which he visited were some of what he called the Indies, or islands near India. For a long time everyone else supposed so too, and hence it is that Cuba and the neighboring islands have always been called the West Indies. About this time the Pope divided between Spain and Portugal all the newly discovered lands, and all that might afterwards be discovered. The dividing line was a meridian passing 300 leagues west of the Azores. Spain's share was all that lay west of this meridian, and Portugal's all that lay east of it. Spain was jealous of Portugal and anxious to secure a part of that kingdom's share. Columbus suggested a way to do this. He assured Ferdinand and Isabella that by sailing still farther to the westward, beyond the West Indies, it would be possible to reach some of the islands which might be claimed by Portugal, and of course he was correct in this view. He asked the sovereigns for a fleet with which to make the attempt, and in 1502, with 4 ships and 150 men, he set sail from Cadiz. On the voyage he landed at Jamaica and other islands, but although he was absent for more than 2 years, he accomplished nothing of importance. He returned to Spain in 1504 and died 2 years later. His body was buried at Valladolid, but was afterwards carried across the ocean and interred in the Cathedral of Santo Domingo on the island of Haiti. When that island was ceded by the Spaniards to France, the remains of the great navigator were removed to Havana, and there they rested until after the war between the United States and Spain, when they were taken back to Spain. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
Chapter 3 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Herron and A.B. Poland. Chapter 3. Ferdinand of Aragon, 1452 to 1516. Ferdinand of Aragon was the son of John II, king of the Spanish provinces of Navarre and Aragon. For centuries before Ferdinand's time, Spain had been divided into a number of petty kingdoms. Some of them were in the hands of the Christians, and the rest belonged to the Moors, whose ancestors were partly Arabs and partly people of North Africa. The Moors were Mohammedans. About 700 years before the time of Ferdinand they had crossed the Mediterranean Sea and invaded Spain, capturing nearly the whole of that country with the exception of the provinces which lay in the extreme north. For a long time, therefore, Spain was a Mohammedan country, but the Spanish Christians became more numerous and more powerful, and during the time of the Crusades they were almost continually at war with their Moorish neighbours. At the time that Ferdinand was born, they had regained all Spain except the one kingdom of Granada. In Granada several thousand Moors still lived. They irrigated the land and cultivated rice. They planted mulberry trees and were famed for their production of silk. They even grew sugar cane, and were the first to make Europeans acquainted with sugar. The beautiful city of Granada was their capital and great stronghold at the time when Ferdinand became king, and even today travellers go by thousands to see the remains of its splendid palaces. Ferdinand married Isabella, who was the Queen of Castile, so that under these two sovereigns 3 of the Christian kingdoms of Spain, Aragon, Navarre, and Castile, were united. It seemed to them, however, a disgrace to Christianity as well as an injury to Spain that there should be a Mohammedan kingdom in their country. They therefore determined to add Granada to their domains, and a bitter war against the Moors was begun. General Gonsalvo, a famous soldier, whom the Spaniards still delight to call the Great Captain, was put in command of the Spanish army. Granada was invaded. Sallies were made by the Moors, and many single combats were fought between their champions and the Christian knights. But no great battle was fought, and the war continued for months. At one time the Spanish camp of tents took fire by accident and was destroyed. A permanent town with houses of stone was then built by Ferdinand for his army. The town still stands and is called Santa Fe. When the Moorish king, who was named Boabdil, heard that King Ferdinand had threatened to take Granada, he laughed in scorn. Nevertheless, he at once made ready to defend his city. The war lasted more than 10 years. The Moors defended themselves bravely, but the Spaniards devastated the fruitful lands of their country, totally destroyed 24 of their principal towns, and then besieged the city of Granada itself. The Moors held out bravely for almost a year, then, being on the verge of starvation, they surrendered Granada. It was agreed that Boabdil should reign over a small territory, and should do homage to Ferdinand for it. He soon grew tired of his little kingdom, however, and crossed the Mediterranean to Africa, where, not long afterwards, he perished in battle. He was the last of the Moorish kings of Spain. The year 1492 proved to be a memorable one for Ferdinand and Isabella, and for the country which they governed. It began with the conquest of Granada, and it ended in seeing Spain's condition wonderfully improved in almost every particular. For 200 years the Turks had been the terror of Christendom. Christians who traded with India were obliged to sail across the Mediterranean Sea, and to pass through lands that belonged to the Turks to reach that country. They had also to bring back through those lands and across the Mediterranean whatever goods they bought in India. Their ships and cargoes were often captured by Turkish pirates, and the owners and crews were made slaves. Thousands of such Christian slaves were chained to the rowing benches of the Turkish galleys, and were cruelly whipped if they did not obey their masters. The people of those times wished to find a way by which to reach India without encountering these difficulties and dangers. More than once did the different nations of Europe join together to make war against the Turks. Ferdinand himself, after taking Granada from the Moors, sent a fleet across the Mediterranean and captured Algiers, the great stronghold of the Turkish pirates. Many Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese Christians who had been slaves for years came home, most of them sick and all of them poor. You can imagine how the sight of them, when they landed, made the people wish for some safer way to India. When, therefore, Columbus offered to find one, Ferdinand and Isabella supplied him with money and ships and men. He did not, indeed, find a new way to India, but he thought he had done so, and so did the king and queen. The people of Spain and of Europe generally rejoiced at the thought that trade with India could in future be carried on without so great a loss of life and treasure. While Columbus failed in this one important point, his discoveries were of great value to Spain, for they gave her immense possessions in the New World and added largely to her wealth and power. Ferdinand was at first rather cold toward Columbus. He did not have much faith either in the great discoverer or in his plans. The real credit of Spain's assistance belongs far more to Queen Isabella than to King Ferdinand. But by consolidating and strengthening his dominions, Ferdinand lifted Spain into a prominent position among the European nations, and his influence was felt for many years after his death, which occurred in 1516. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Harron and A.B. Poland. Chapter 4. Vasco da Gama, 1469 to 1524. One day in the year 1497, King Manuel of Portugal was at work in his study. It was 5 years since Columbus had brought the news to Ferdinand of Aragon that a way to the Indies had been discovered by sailing westward. For Columbus, as we have learned, supposed that the islands on which he had landed were some of the East India Islands. Manuel was busy planning an expedition which he hoped might discover a passage to the Indies by sailing eastward. A nobleman entered the room where he was sitting. "Vasco da Gama," said the king, when he saw him, "I make you captain of my expedition. Take any one of the ships you please, and let your brother command another. If it please God, you will discover India." 3 ships not larger than the schooners which sail up and down our rivers were lying at anchor in the harbor of Lisbon. They were named after 3 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. They were laden with everything which the king and Vasco thought might be useful on a voyage of discovery, and among the men who were to sail in them were carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, and other such skilled workmen as were likely to be of service. When the vessels were ready to start, a solemn service was held in the great cathedral of Lisbon. All who were going on the expedition were there. The king and queen were also present, and when the bishop had pronounced the blessing, the king presented Vasco da Gama the royal standard. "Let it fly," he said, "at the masthead of your ship." From the cathedral, Vasco and his men marched to the harbor. The ships were decorated with flags, and the king's standard was run up at the masthead of the one which Vasco was to command. Guns were fired, the anchors were heaved, the sails were loosed, and the little fleet floated down to the mouth of the river. There in the port of Belem they waited 3 days for a fair wind, and then the voyage began. A Portuguese writer said, "So many tears were shed when they were sailing away that the shore may well be named the shore of tears." And Camões, the great poet of Portugal, wrote, "Unaccounted as the grains of golden sand, the tears of thousands fell on Belem's strand." The ships were so long sailing down the coast of Africa that the sailors became discouraged. They insisted that the land must extend entirely across the sea, and that it had no end. Vasco da Gama knew that it had an end, for another great navigator, named Bartholomew Diaz, had already found the end and called it the Cape of Storms, because of the very bad weather he had encountered there. Near this cape Vasco also met with storms, and his men wished to turn back. But like Columbus, Vasco was determined to go on. Some of the men formed a conspiracy to kill him, and he was obliged to put the mutineers in irons. At length they doubled the cape, sailed to the northeastward, and left the storms behind them. The ships had been greatly damaged by the winds and waves. They were leaking badly, and the sailors had to work at the pumps night and day. Wearied and disheartened, they again requested that the voyage might be given up, and that they might be allowed to return to their homes. Vasco saw that the ships must be repaired, and besides this, all were in need of water. He therefore steered toward the land and kept a sharp lookout for a safe harbor. If you look at the map of Africa, you will see that part of the southeast coast is called Natal. This is the Portuguese name for Christmas Day. Vasco named this part of the coast Natal because he sailed past it on that day. Farther on, the voyagers were delighted to see the mouth of a river. Steering into it and sailing some distance up the stream, they found a place where they could land. There they stayed some time and repaired their ships. One, however, was so battered and broken that she could not be made seaworthy. They therefore took her to pieces and used the wood to repair the other two. Vasco named this stream the River of Mercy. One day some of the natives came to visit them. The sailors offered them slices of bread with marmalade, but their visitors did not taste a morsel until they saw the Portuguese eating. When they had once tasted, it seemed as though they would never have enough. Da Gama showed them a looking-glass, a thing they had never seen before. They were greatly amused and laughed loudly when they saw their faces reflected in it. Sailing from the River of Mercy, Vasco steered northward, keeping always in sight of land. After some days he saw a ship at anchor and at once sent a boat to find out where he was. But the native sailors were afraid, and jumping into a canoe, paddled away as fast as they could. The Portuguese boat soon overtook them, and then all but one of the natives threw themselves into the sea and swam to shore. The one remaining in the canoe could not swim, and so the Portuguese took him on board one of their ships. He proved to be a Moor, and as he was able to act as an interpreter, he became very useful to them. Not long after this, another vessel was seen. She was under full sail, but Vasco's ship soon came up with her. Two Negroes on board the strange vessel spoke a language that some of the Negroes on the ships of the Portuguese understood, and from them they learned that she was on her way to a harbor of India called Cambay. This was good news to Da Gama, and they followed her into an African harbor called Mozambique. It was now nearly a year since they had sailed from Lisbon, and all were delighted to enter a port where they could see houses and people. Soon after they came to anchor, the sheik, or governor of the city of Mozambique, paid them a visit. He came upon two canoes lashed together, poles and planks being placed upon them to make a floor, above which was stretched a large piece of matting. Under the matting sat the sheik and 10 companions. The sheik wore a jacket of velvet. A blue cloth embroidered with threads of gold was wrapped around his body, and a silken sash was tied around his waist. A dagger was stuck in his sash, and he carried a sword in his hand. When he reached, the ship's trumpets were sounded, and Vasco and his officers greeted him with the heartiest welcome. The Moor interpreted everything that they said, or that the Portuguese said to them. The sheik asked the Portuguese of what merchandise they were in search. Thereupon they showed him some pepper, cinnamon, and ginger. He then promised to send pilots who would steer their vessels to India, and after he left the ships, 2 men came on board who said they had been sent for that purpose. Before the Portuguese were ready to resume their voyage, the sheik invited Vasco to dine with him, and advised that all the sick men should be sent on shore. Vasco learned from his Moor that this was a trick to get them into the sheik's power, and so he declined the invitation. A boat was sent to get fresh water, and one of the sheik's pilots went to show the Portuguese where the spring was. He said that midnight was the only time at which they could row to the spring because of the tide, but from midnight until morning he kept them rowing about from place to place, and no water was found. Seeing at length that the Portuguese were growing angry, he jumped overboard and swam a long distance under water, not rising till he was far away from the boat. In this way he escaped. Vasco now sailed away, but he put the other pilot in irons. He could not trust him, for the Moor had found out that the sheik had ordered both the pilots to steer the ships upon the shoals and wreck them. The next harbor Vasco reached was Mombasa. The Sheik of Mozambique had sent word to the king, who was a friend of his, that 2 ships would soon arrive at Mombasa, whose captains were great robbers, that they meant to bring a large fleet and take possession of Mombasa and Mozambique, and that the wisest thing to do was to make prisoners of the strangers and put them to death. As soon as the king of Mombasa learned that the 2 ships had actually arrived outside the harbor, he sent a kind message to Vasco, inviting him to land and make a treaty. He sent 2 pilots to take the vessels into harbor because there were dangerous shoals at its entrance. He also sent a large boat loaded with sheep, sugarcane, citrons, lemons, and oranges as a present. The sick men were delighted with the fruit. Vasco sent 2 men on shore to buy some other things that were needed, but the king said they might have whatever they wished without paying. A guide was given to them who took them all over the city, and particularly to a part where, he said, Christians lived. The people there pretended to be Christians, but were not. They treated the Portuguese kindly and begged them to stop all night at their houses. This kindness was only pretended. The truth was that the king had given orders to the pilots to run Vasco's vessels on the shoals of the harbor, and they tried to do it. Vasco's ship, however, did not obey the helm when they were turning to enter the harbor, but it went so close to the shoal that the officer in command ordered the sailors to let go the anchor and haul down the sails. In a moment this was done, and the other ship did the same. The 2 pilots, thinking their plans were discovered, jumped into the water and swam to a boat and escaped. Vasco determined to leave these treacherous people at once, but his anchor had become fixed so firmly in the rocks of the shoal that the crew could not raise it. They labored at this all night, and the cable parting in the morning, they had to leave the anchor and sail away without it. The next port that they reached was Melinda. Here they were treated with real kindness, for a soothsayer, whom the king trusted, told him that the Portuguese would some day be lords of India, and that he had better make a treaty with them. The king therefore invited Vasco and his brother to land and settle upon the terms of a treaty. The Portuguese, however, were distrustful. They proposed that the king and they should have their talk sitting in boats near the shore, and to this the king agreed. Vasco and his brother dressed themselves in their handsomest suits, and went in their boats seated on chairs that were covered with crimson velvet. Each of the boats carried 2 small guns, which were fired as a salute, and then the crews rowed toward the shore. The king now came on board one of the boats and sat on a seat prepared for him. He said that he wished to be always friendly with the King of Portugal. Vasco da Gama and his brother knelt to kiss the king's hand, and he made them rise. Then the trumpets sounded and the ships fired all their guns. Vasco presented to the king a splendid sword in a case of gold, saying, "Sire, we give you this sword in the name of our king, and promise to maintain peace and friendship with you forever." The king answered, "I promise and swear by my religion to keep peace and friendship forever with my new brother, the King of Portugal." Thousands of the king's people were gathered on the shore and witnessed all this. After the treaty had been made, Vasco wished at once to sail to India, but he had to cross the great Indian Ocean, and favorable winds would not blow until August, and it was now only May. So for 3 months the Portuguese remained at Melinda. Just before they sailed, Vasco erected on a hill near the city a white marble column on which was inscribed the name of King Manuel. As a parting gift, the king of Melinda sent to the Portuguese a large boatload of rice, butter, sugar, coconuts, sheep, fowls, and vegetables. Sailing eastward now for about 20 days, Vasco at length sighted land. It was the shore of Calicut, a city in India. The vessels were soon anchored in the harbor. Thus the great sea route to the land of silks and spices had been discovered. A factory or trading house was established at Calicut, and for the next 100 years little Portugal was the sovereign of the eastern seas and the greatest commercial nation of Europe. Da Gama died in 1524. The Portuguese honor him as we honor Columbus, and Camões made him the hero of his Lusiad, the greatest poem in the Portuguese language. End of chapter 4. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.